The encounter. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Jack adjusted his heavy jacket as the cold night air wrapped around him. The faint rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only sounds that kept him company. He had spent years in these woods, trapping animals and living off the land. But tonight felt different. Jack crouched near a clearing, his hands working swiftly as he set up another one of his handmade traps. It was a simple mechanism, but effective. He needed something to keep him busy. The strange light he had seen streaking across the sky earlier still bothered him. It wasn't a shooting star, not with the way it changed direction and vanished behind the hills. He had shrugged it off at first, thinking it was some military experiment. But now, as the silence pressed down on him, his mind kept circling back to that light. Just as he was about to finish, he heard it, a faint whirring sound, like a broken machine struggling to stay alive. Jack froze. His sharp eyes scanned the shadows, but he saw nothing. Slowly, he reached for his hunting knife, gripping it tightly as he moved toward the sound. The noise grew louder, mixed with strange clicks and beeps. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. Whatever it wasn't a sound he had ever heard in the forest before. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves. Then he saw it. In the middle of the clearing, something metallic glinted under the moonlight. It was a small drum-like object, unlike anything Jack had ever seen. Its sleek surface was covered in glowing blue lines that pulsed faintly, as if it were alive. One of its propellers was bent, and sparks occasionally shot out from its side. Jack crouched low, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but his curiosity held him in place. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. Before he could inspect it further, the drone emitted a sharp, high-pitched sound. Jack winced, covering his ears, but the noise was gone as quickly as it came. He looked up, his breath catching in his throat. The device's glowing lines began to blink rapidly, and then it projected a dim light into the air, a beacon. Jack didn't know what the beacon was calling, but he wasn't about to stick around to find out. He moved quickly, resetting the trap he had abandoned earlier and placing it near the drone. If something, or someone, was coming, he wanted to be prepared. He climbed a nearby tree, positioning himself on a sturdy branch with a clear view of the clearing. His knife was still in his hand, and his eyes were fixed on the strange object below. Minutes passed. Jack's patience was wearing thin when he saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows. At first, he thought it was another human, but as the figure stepped into the moonlight, he realized how wrong he was. It was a girl, or at least something that looked like one. She had pale, almost silvery skin that seemed to shimmer faintly. Her hair was a soft, glowing white, and her eyes. Jack couldn't look away from her eyes. They were larger than normal, with irises that shifted between colors, like an oil slick. She moved cautiously, her bare feet barely making a sound as she approached the drone. Jack tightened his grip on his knife. She didn't look dangerous, but appearances could be deceiving. He watched as she knelt beside the drone, her delicate hands hovering over its surface. Her expression was a mix of worry and frustration. She tapped a device on her wrist, and a soft hum filled the air. The drone sparked to life, its lights glowing brighter. Then it happened. The trap snapped shut around her ankle with a loud metallic clang. She let out a sharp cry, stumbling backward as she tried to free herself. Jack hesitated for a moment before climbing down from the tree. His heart raced as he approached her, knife in hand. "Don't move," he barked, keeping his distance. The girl's head snapped up, and her eyes locked onto his. She didn't speak, but her lips moved, forming words Jack couldn't understand. Her voice was soft and melodic, but it only added to his confusion. She pointed at her trapped ankle, then at him, desperation written all over her face. Jack's mind was spinning. This wasn't an animal, and it wasn't some ordinary person. What was she? Where had she come from? "Who are you?" he demanded, though he doubted she could understand him. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she touched the device on her wrist again, and a small holographic image appeared above it. It showed a ship, sleek and alien, crashing through Earth's atmosphere. Jack's eyes widened as he realized what she was trying to say. You crashed here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her expression pleading. Before Jack could decide what to do, a distant hum echoed through the forest. It was the same sound he had heard earlier, but louder now, and getting closer. The girl's eyes widened in fear. She pointed toward the trees, then back at her trapped leg, urging Jack to release her. Jack hesitated, torn between his instincts and the strange pull he felt toward this otherworldly girl. The humming grew louder, and Jack knew one thing for certain. Whatever was coming, it wasn't friendly. "Damn it," he muttered, stepping forward to free her. Misunderstandings and secrets. The cabin was dimly lit, with the warm glow of a single lantern casting flickering shadows on the rough wooden walls. Jack paced nervously, his hunting knife still clutched in one hand. Across the room, the alien girl sat on the floor, her back pressed against the wall. Her shimmering silver skin and glowing white hair looked otherworldly against the cabin's rustic setting. She watched him with wide, unblinking eyes, her wristband occasionally emitting soft, rhythmic beeps. Jack had never felt so out of his depth. Trapping wild animals, surviving the elements, outsmarting hunters, that was his life. But this? An alien girl with strange tech, hunted by who knows what, sitting in his cabin like she belonged in a science fiction movie. He rubbed the back of his neck, unsure of what to do next. "You're not going to try anything stupid, are you?" he asked, his voice gruff. The girl tilted her head, clearly not understanding him. She raised her hands slowly, palms up, in what looked like a universal gesture of peace. Jack sighed, lowering the knife, but keeping it within reach. "All right, fine. Let's start simple," he muttered, pulling a notepad and pencil from a nearby shelf. He sketched a crude image of Earth, a circle with a stick figure human next to it. Then, pointing to himself, he said, "Earth. Human. Me. Jack." The girl leaned forward, her colorful, shifting eyes scanning the drawing. She nodded slowly, then touched her wristband. A small holographic map appeared above it, showing Earth from space. A blinking red dot indicated a location somewhere in the woods. "Great," Jack said sarcastically. "You know where you are." "Fantastic. But why are you here?" The girl frowned, her expression growing serious. She gestured to the hologram, swiping it to reveal another image, a sleek spacecraft with visible damage, flames trailing behind it as it hurtled toward Earth. Then she pointed to herself and mind steering, her hands gripping an imaginary control panel. "So you're a pilot," Jack guessed. "Crashed here, huh?" She nodded again. Her fingers danced across her wristband, pulling up another hologram. This time, it showed strange symbols and alien text that Jack couldn't begin to decipher. Embedded in the display were images of other ships, larger, more menacing, hovering ominously above Earth. She pointed at the ships, then at herself, shaking her head and crossing her arms in an X shape. Jack frowned. "You're saying you're not with them?" The girl's expression softened as she nodded. She pointed at the larger ships again, then at Jack. Her hands moved rapidly, miming what looked like an attack. Finally, she pressed her palms together and held them up toward him, her expression pleading. Jack pieced it together. "They're after you, aren't they? And if they find you, they'll come for us too." The girl didn't need to speak for him to see the fear in her eyes. Jack cursed under his breath. He had been right. This was way bigger than he'd anticipated. His cabin was remote, sure, but if those ships came looking for her, hiding her here wouldn't do much good. Still, he couldn't just turn her away. "All right," he said, setting the notepad down. "You stay here. I'll figure something out." The girl's relief was almost palpable. She smiled faintly, But the moment was interrupted by a low mechanical hum outside. Jack froze, his heart pounding. The sound grew louder, reverberating through the forest like a distant engine. "They're here already," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. The girl leaped to her feet, her wristband flashing red. She pressed a button, and a hologram shifted to show two dots moving closer to the cabin's location. Her expression hardened, and she pointed at Jack, then toward the cabin door. "No way," Jack said firmly. "If they're coming, we fight." The girl shook her head, gesturing toward the window. Jack followed her gaze and saw faint lights in the distance, weaving through the trees. They were moving too smoothly to belong to any human vehicle. Jack grabbed his rifle from the corner of the room, checking the chamber. "You've got some fancy tech," he said, nodding at her wristband. "You better use it." The girl hesitated, then pressed another button on her device. A translucent shield of light shimmered briefly around her before fading. She pointed at Jack, and mind shooting, then at herself, and mind deflecting. Jack realized she was trying to tell him something important. Her tech could protect her, but he would need to fight. "Great," he muttered. "Guess I'm the bait." The humming outside grew louder, accompanied by sharp clicking sounds, like metal claws tapping against stone. Jack moved to the window and peered out. Two sleek, spider-like machines were moving through the underbrush, their glowing red eyes scanning the forest. Each had long, jointed legs and a smooth armor-like exterior. One of them paused, its head swiveling toward the cabin. Jack's blood ran cold. "We've got company." The girl tapped his shoulder, her eyes intense. She held out a small, glowing orb from her belt, and mind throwing it. Jack nodded, understanding her plan. "All right," he whispered. "Let's give them a warm welcome." As the machines approached, Jack braced himself. Whatever these things were, they had made one mistake. They underestimated the human spirit. And Jack wasn't about to let them take this girl without a fight. Trust and survival. The morning light broke through the thick canopy of trees, casting golden streaks on the forest floor. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, gripping his rifle tightly. His eyes darted between the shadows, ears tuned to the faint rustle of leaves. Behind him, the alien girl, Alira, as she had motioned to call herself, was crouched near the remains of the spider-like machines from the night before. She was using her glowing wristband to scan their broken parts, her silver fingers moving with precision. Jack hadn't slept. After the intense battle, every snap of a twig or whisper of wind had him on edge. The spider machines had been tougher than anything he'd ever faced, their armor deflecting bullets like stones skipping off water. If it hadn't been for Alira's tech, a strange orb that detonated with a pulse of electromagnetic energy, they wouldn't have stood a chance. "Anything useful in those things?" Jack called out, not looking back. Alira glanced up, her colorful, swirling eyes meeting his. She gave a small nod and held up a piece of glowing circuitry. It looked like a tangled mess of wires and glass, but Alira seemed to know exactly what it was. She pointed at her wristband, then at the circuit, making a twisting motion with her hands. "You're going to use that to fix your tech," Jack guessed, lowering his rifle slightly. Alira nodded again, her expression calm but focused. Jack marveled at her composure. Despite being hunted, stranded on a strange planet, and relying on a complete stranger, she hadn't panicked once. Not like he had when those machines had burst through the cabin walls. "Wish I had your nerves," he muttered, turning his attention back to the forest. "So, what's next?" "More of those things coming for us." Alira stood, dusting off her hands. She walked over to Jack and tapped his shoulder gently, motioning toward the sky. Her wristband projected a holographic map again, showing their position and two large red dots moving closer. Then she pointed to a green dot, a location deeper into the forest, farther than Jack had ever ventured. "You want to go there?" he asked, frowning. "What's out there?" Alira tilted her head, thinking, before gesturing at her wristband and miming pressing buttons. Jack didn't need much imagination to figure it out. "Your ship," he said, realization dawning. "You're trying to get back to your ship." She nodded emphatically, her expression almost hopeful. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. The cabin was no longer safe, not after last night, and staying meant certain death. Still, trekking deeper into the wilderness with an alien girl and potentially facing more hunters wasn't exactly his idea of a great plan. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "We'll head for your ship. But if those things show up again, we're doing it my way." "Got it." Alara hesitated, then extended her hand. Jack stared at it for a moment before shaking it. Her grip was surprisingly firm, and her faint smile felt oddly reassuring. The journey began quietly. Alara moved through the forest with an almost supernatural grace, her bare feet barely making a sound as she weaved between trees. Jack followed closely, his rifle slung over his shoulder and a pack of supplies strapped to his back. He kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see red eyes glowing in the shadows. After hours of walking, they came across a shallow stream. Jack knelt to fill his canteen, watching as Alara crouched beside him. She dipped her hand into the water, her expression curious. She cupped the liquid in her palms, examining it as if it were something alien to her. "You've never seen water like this before?" Jack asked, amused. Alara shook her head, then pressed her fingers to her lips as if tasting it. Her eyes widened, and she smiled brightly, nodding as if to say it was good. Jack couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, welcome to Earth," he said, taking a sip from his canteen. "We've got plenty of water. Not much else going for us, though." The moment of levity didn't last long. A sudden crack echoed through the trees, sharp and unnatural. Jack froze, his instincts kicking in. He pulled Alara down beside him, motioning for her to stay quiet. His eyes scanned the forest, his heart pounding. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the clicking of the spider machines, but something heavier, more deliberate. Jack raised his rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger. Alara tugged on his sleeve, pointing to her wristband. She activated it, and a faint glow surrounded them both. Jack realized it was some sort of cloaking field, blending them into the surroundings. It wasn't perfect. If someone looked closely, they might see the distortion, but it was better than nothing. Moments later, a figure stepped into view. It was humanoid but taller and more imposing, its armor glinting under the sunlight. Its helmet had a single glowing red visor that swept back and forth like a scanner. In its hand was a long, spear-like weapon that crackled with energy. Jack's breath caught. "Great," he whispered. "They'd got foot soldiers now." The armored figure paused, its visor locking onto the stream. It stepped forward, scanning the area where Jack and Alara were hiding. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened, but Alara placed a hand on his arm, shaking her head. She pointed to the soldier, then at her wristband, and made a small explosion gesture. "You've got something for that," Jack whispered. Alara nodded, her eyes determined. She reached into her belt and pulled out another glowing orb, this one smaller than the one she used before. She handed it to Jack, motioning for him to throw it at the soldier. "Me," he hissed. "Why me?" She gestured to the cloaking field around them. Then mind throwing the orb again. Jack realized that if she moved, the field would collapse. He groaned quietly. "Fine," he muttered, "but this better work." Jack took a deep breath, steadying himself. The soldier was only a few feet away now, its visor sweeping dangerously close. With a quick, silent motion, Jack lobbed the orb toward its feet. The explosion wasn't loud, but the effect was instant. A wave of blue energy rippled outward, short-circuiting the soldier's systems. It staggered, its weapon falling to the ground as its visor flickered. Jack didn't wait. He lunged forward, tackling the disoriented figure and pinning it down. "Now what?" he growled, glancing back at Alara. She was already moving, her wristband projecting a series of symbols onto the soldier's armor. The glow from her device intensified, and the soldier went still, its systems completely shut down. Jack stepped back, panting. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Lyra smiled faintly, but pointed to the holographic map again. The red dots were still moving toward them, faster now. "No time to celebrate," Jack said, grabbing his rifle. "Let's keep moving." Together, they disappeared into the trees, the forest swallowing them as the hunt continued. Hunted by shadows. The forest was a maze of shadows as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Jack's breath came in sharp bursts as he trudged through the dense undergrowth, rifle in hand. Behind him, Lyra moved silently, her glowing eyes scanning the darkening woods for threats. Her wristband's soft blue glow was the only light they dared to use. The air was heavy, charged with an unnatural energy that prickled at Jack's skin. He glanced over his shoulder at Lyra, who had stopped to inspect her wristband again. The holographic map displayed the two ominous red dots trailing them, now alarmingly close. "They're gaining on us," Jack said, his voice low but tense. "If we keep this pace, we won't make it to your ship in time." Lyra nodded but didn't reply. Instead, she tapped a few buttons on her device, and the map expanded to reveal the terrain ahead. She pointed to a cluster of jagged cliffs not far from their location. A faint green light pulsed on the hologram, marking what Jack guessed was their destination. "You're saying we can lose them there?" Jack asked, trying to interpret her gestures. She nodded again, then mimed something falling. "Rocks, maybe." Jack frowned. The cliffs might offer cover, but it sounded like she was planning something more drastic. "All right," he said, adjusting the strap of his rifle. "Lead the way. But if this plan of yours backfires, we're both done for." The journey to the cliffs was fraught with tension. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves had Jack on edge, his finger hovering over the trigger of his rifle. Lyra moved with an uncanny grace, her glowing eyes darting between the trees. She occasionally paused, holding up a hand to signal Jack to stop, her sensitive ears picking up sounds he couldn't hear. After what felt like hours, they reached the base of the cliffs. The towering rock formations loomed over them, their jagged edges silhouetted against the starry sky. A narrow path wound upward, barely wide enough for one person at a time. "We're really doing this, huh?" Jack muttered, eyeing the precarious trail. "Great." Lyra didn't hesitate. She began climbing, her lithe frame navigating the rocks with ease. Jack followed, muttering curses under his breath, as loose stones crumbled beneath his boots. The higher they climbed, the colder the air became, and the forest below shrank into a dark expanse. Halfway up the cliffs, Lyra stopped. She crouched low, her eyes fixed on the forest below. Jack joined her, his heart sinking as he followed her gaze. Two figures were moving through the trees, sleek, humanoid forms with glowing red visors that cut through the darkness. They were different from the spider-like machines they had faced earlier, faster and more agile. "They don't stop, do they?" Jack whispered, tightening his grip on his rifle. Lyra glanced at him, then pointed to a large boulder perched precariously on the edge of the cliff above them. She mimed pushing it, then gestured toward the figures below. "You're serious?" Jack asked, raising an eyebrow. "You think one rock is going to stop those things?" Lyra didn't answer. She climbed higher, motioning for Jack to follow. As they reached the boulder, Jack saw what she had in mind. The path below was narrow, forcing their pursuers to pass directly beneath them. If they timed it right, the boulder could block their path or crush them outright. "Fine," Jack said, positioning himself beside her. "But if this doesn't work, we're out of options." The two figures below moved closer, their red visors scanning the cliffs. Jack's pulse quickened as one of them paused, its head tilting upward. For a moment, he thought they'd been spotted, but the figure resumed its climb, following the path below. Lyra placed her hands on the boulder, motioning for Jack to do the same. Together, they pushed, their combined strength slowly dislodging the massive rock. Jack's muscles burned, and his boots slipped against the uneven ground, but the boulder finally gave way. The massive rock tumbled down the cliff with a thunderous roar, crashing onto the narrow path below. One of the figures was caught directly in its path, crushed instantly. The other managed to leap to safety, clinging to the cliffside with razor-sharp claws. "Dame," Jack muttered, raising his rifle. "These things don't go down easy." The surviving hunter began scaling the cliff with terrifying speed, its glowing visor locked onto them. Jack fired, the sharp crack of his rifle echoing through the night. The bullets ricocheted off the hunter's armor, barely slowing it down. "Any other brilliant ideas?" Jack called out to Elira. She didn't respond. Instead, she activated her wristband, and a glowing orb materialized in her hand. She hurled it downward, the orb exploding in a flash of light that sent the hunter sprawling. Its claws lost their grip, and it plummeted into the darkness below. Jack exhaled sharply, lowering his rifle. "That's 2 down. How many more of these things are out there?" Elira didn't answer. She pointed to the holographic map on her wristband, which now showed only one red dot, distant but moving toward them at an alarming speed. "Another one," Jack said, his voice laced with frustration. "We can't keep doing this." Elira gestured toward the top of the cliff, urging him to keep moving. Jack gritted his teeth and followed, his legs aching with every step. By the time they reached the summit, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, casting a pale light over the landscape. In the distance, Jack saw it, a sleek, metallic ship half buried in the earth. Its hull was scorched, and parts of it were covered in moss, but it was intact. "Your ship," Jack said, a note of relief in his voice. "We made it." But Elira's expression remained tense. She pointed to the horizon, where a faint, ominous glow marked the approach of the final hunter. Jack sighed, raising his rifle once more. "Guess we're not done yet." The battle wasn't over. The shadows were still hunting. The truth revealed. The ship was a marvel of alien engineering. Even in its damaged state, it gleamed under the rising sun, a silver vessel that seemed to pulse faintly with its own life. Jagged scorch marks marred its surface, and one wing was bent at an awkward angle, but the sheer size and sleek design of the craft made it clear. This was no ordinary spacecraft. It was built for speed, power, and perhaps something far more significant. Jack leaned against a tree, panting as he surveyed the crash site. Elira was already moving toward the ship, her steps quick but deliberate. Her wristband glowed faintly as she pointed it at the vessel, scanning its structure. Jack had followed her this far, fought alongside her, and seen things he would never have believed. But as he watched her examine the ship, he realized he still didn't fully understand her purpose. "You mind explaining what's so special about that thing?" Jack called out, his voice trained. Elira glanced back at him, her swirling eyes narrowing slightly. She motioned for him to follow, then tapped her wristband. A holographic interface appeared, displaying a sequence of symbols and diagrams that Jack couldn't decipher. "Right," he muttered, stepping closer. "Forgot I don't speak alien." She tilted her head, then pressed a button on the device. The hologram shifted to a more universal image: Earth, surrounded by several massive ships. The larger ships were positioned ominously, as if preparing for an invasion. A smaller dot, Elira's ship, was marked near the planet, trailing a line that suggested it had been intercepted. "So, you're a scout," Jack guessed, piecing together what he could. "You came here to, what? Warn us? Spy on us?" Elira frowned, clearly frustrated by the language barrier. She tapped her wristband again, pulling up another hologram. This one showed 2 distinct groups of aliens. One, a peaceful delegation extending open hands. The other, a militarized force with weapons raised. Elira pointed to herself, then to the peaceful group, before gesturing to the militant faction and shaking her head emphatically. Jack's stomach sank. "You're telling me there's a war coming, and we're caught in the middle?" She nodded solemnly. Then she pointed to the ship behind her, tapping her wristband again to display what looked like a power core. The image flickered, showing a cracked, glowing orb surrounded by symbols Jack didn't recognize. "That's why you need to get back to your ship," Jack realized. "You're trying to warn your people, or stop theirs." Aelira's face softened as she nodded again, her expression a mix of urgency and exhaustion. She motioned toward the ship's open hatch, beckoning Jack to follow her inside. The interior of the ship was unlike anything Jack had ever seen. The walls shimmered with a faint bioluminescent glow, and the air was strangely warm, carrying a faint metallic tang. The control panel at the center of the room was alive with blinking lights and holographic displays, though several were dark, clearly damaged in the crash. Aelira moved with purpose, heading straight for the central console. She placed her wristband against a slot, and the ship responded immediately, lights flickering to life as a low hum filled the cabin. Jack stood back, watching in awe as the technology seemed to heal itself, sparks of light crawling over broken panels like tiny fireflies. "What is all this?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just some ordinary ship, is it?" Aelira didn't answer directly. Instead, she activated another hologram, this one showing a strange, spherical device housed deep within the ship. The image zoomed in, revealing the device surrounded by intricate mechanisms and glowing lines of energy. She pointed to it, then to herself, and finally to the hologram of Earth. Jack's eyes narrowed. "That thing. It's important, isn't it? Some kind of weapon." She shook her head quickly, her expression almost offended. She tapped her wristband again, and the hologram shifted to show the device releasing a wave of light. The wave passed over Earth, dissolving the image of the invading ships while leaving the planet untouched. Jack's heart skipped a beat. "It's not a weapon. It's a shield. You're trying to protect us." Aelira nodded, relief flickering in her eyes as she saw understanding dawn on his face. But before either of them could say another word, a distant hum broke through the silence. It was the sound Jack had come to dread. The telltale noise of an approaching hunter. Jack spun around, gripping his rifle as he scanned the forest beyond the ship. The red glow of a visor appeared through the trees, followed by the hulking figure of the final hunter. This one was larger than the others, its armor thicker and its movements more deliberate. It carried a massive weapon that crackled with energy, and its visor flickered menacingly as it locked onto the ship. "We've got trouble," Jack said, stepping back into the ship's entrance. Aelira moved to the console, her fingers flying over the controls. The ship responded with a low rumble, its systems slowly coming online. Jack could see the strain on her face. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't happening fast enough. The hunter raised its weapon, aiming directly at the ship. Jack fired first, the crack of his rifle echoing through the forest. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly off the hunter's armor, but it bought Aelira a few precious seconds. "Tell me you've got something for this," Jack shouted. Aelira didn't look up. Instead, she pulled a small glowing disc from the console and tossed it to Jack. He caught it clumsily, staring at it in confusion. "What the hell am I supposed to do with this?" She pointed at the hunter, then mind-throwing the disc like a grenade. Jack didn't need further explanation. He sprinted out of the ship, dodging behind a fallen tree as the hunter's weapon fired, sending bolts of energy streaking past him. The air crackled with heat, and the ground smoldered where the shots landed. "Come on, you ugly bastard," Jack muttered, gripping the disc tightly. He waited for the hunter to advance, then lobbed the disc at its feet. The result was immediate. The disc emitted a blinding flash of light, followed by a pulse of energy that sent the hunter staggering backward. Its weapon short-circuited, and its movements became jerky, as if its systems were failing. Jack didn't wait. He raised his rifle and fired again, aiming for the exposed joints in its armor. The hunter let out a mechanical screech as it collapsed, its red visor flickering one last time before going dark. Jack leaned against the tree, breathing hard. "You're welcome," he muttered, glancing back at the ship. Alara appeared in the entrance, a faint smile on her face. She gestured for him to come inside, and as he approached, she pointed to the hologram of Earth. The green light pulsing from the spherical device had grown brighter, signaling that the shield was ready to activate. Jack looked at her, his expression serious. "So, what happens now?" Alira's smile faded. She gestured to the ship, then to the sky, and finally to Jack. She pointed to herself, then back to the device. "You're staying?" Jack asked, his chest tightening. "To finish this." She nodded. Jack didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. But one thing was clear. Alara wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all of them. The battle in the shadows. The hum of Alira's ship grew louder as its systems powered up, the faint glow of its hull illuminating the rocky cliffside. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Jack paced near the entrance, his rifle resting against the wall. Alara sat at the ship's central console, her glowing wristband connected to the controls as lines of alien code flickered across the screen. "Are you sure this thing is going to work?" Jack asked, breaking the heavy silence. Alara didn't respond at first. Her swirling, multicolored eyes were locked on the holographic interface. Then she looked up and gave a single nod, her expression calm but resolute. She pointed to a holographic image of the spherical shield generator, which now pulsed with bright, steady light. Jack sighed. "Okay, great. So, you've got your magic shield thing ready to go. But we still have one big problem." He gestured toward the ship's external monitors, where a red dot was slowly but steadily approaching their location. It was the last hunter, larger and more dangerous than any they'd faced before. Alara had confirmed it through her scans. This wasn't just another machine. It was a commander, sent to ensure her capture or elimination. And it was nearly here. The ground beneath the ship trembled as the hunter made its presence known. It stepped into view, towering over the treetops like a mechanical colossus. Its body was encased in thick, black armor, its glowing red visor scanning the area with ruthless precision. In its massive hands, it carried a weapon that resembled a hybrid of a cannon and a blade, crackling with volatile energy. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened as he stared at the monitor. "How the hell do we fight that thing?" Alara stood, her expression grave. She tapped her wristband, pulling up a hologram that displayed the hunter's weak points, small joints near its legs and a vulnerable energy core in its chest. She pointed to the weak spots, then to Jack's rifle, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his stomach knot. "Got it," he said, swallowing hard. "You want me to distract it while you finish your shield, don't you?" Alara nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was light but firm. And for a brief moment, Jack felt a flicker of confidence. Then she handed him another glowing orb, a weapon he now recognized as an electromagnetic disruptor. "Right," he muttered, tucking the orb into his pocket. "Distract the giant death machine while you save the planet. No pressure." Jack stepped out of the ship, the cold night air biting at his skin. The hunter was closer now, its massive frame looming over the cliffside. It moved with deliberate precision, each step shaking the ground like thunder. Jack raised his rifle, aiming for one of its joints. He took a deep breath, steadied his hand, and fired. The shot hit its mark, sparking against the exposed joint. The hunter paused, its visor swiveling toward Jack. Then it let out a deep mechanical roar that reverberated through the forest. Jack felt the ground tremble beneath his feet as the hunter charged, its weapon glowing with lethal energy. "Come on, you big bastard," Jack muttered, retreating toward a cluster of rocks. He fired again, this time aiming for the hunter's chest. The bullet ricocheted off its armor, but it was enough to keep its attention focused on him. The hunter raised its weapon, firing a beam of energy that obliterated the rocks behind Jack. He dove to the ground, rolling to his feet just in time to avoid another blast. His heart pounded as he sprinted toward a narrow crevice, the hunter's heavy footsteps shaking the ground behind him. Inside the ship, Alira worked quickly. Her wristband was connected to the shield generator, and streams of alien code scrolled across the holographic display. Sweat beaded on her brow as she calibrated the device, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Outside, the sounds of the battle grew louder. The crack of Jack's rifle, the deafening roar of the hunter's weapon. A sudden tremor shook the ship, and Alira glanced at the monitors. The hunter had fired another blast, narrowly missing Jack, but leaving a smoking crater in the cliffside. Alira's expression tightened. She couldn't afford to waste any more time. She pressed a final sequence of commands into her wristband, and the shield generator emitted a deep hum. A wave of energy rippled through the ship, and the holographic display showed the device fully charged. But before she could activate it, an alarm blared, a proximity alert. Alira turned to the monitor, her heart sinking. The hunter had changed course. It was no longer chasing Jack. It was coming straight for the ship. Jack saw the shift in the hunter's movements and cursed under his breath. "No, no, no, you're not going after her," he shouted, pulling the disruptor orb from his pocket. He sprinted back toward the ship, dodging another energy blast as the hunter turned its weapon on him. Jack hurled the disruptor orb with all his strength, aiming for the hunter's chest. The orb exploded on impact, releasing a pulse of energy that caused the hunter to stagger. Its visor flickered, and sparks erupted from its armor. But it wasn't enough to bring the machine down. Jack didn't stop. He reached the ship's entrance and banged on the hull. "Alira, whatever you're doing in there, do it faster." Alira appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide but determined. She motioned for Jack to come inside, but he shook his head. "No time. Finish it," he yelled, turning back to face the hunter. The hunter recovered quickly, its weapon crackling with energy as it prepared to fire. Jack raised his rifle, aiming for the glowing core in its chest. He fired repeatedly, each shot chipping away at the armor protecting the core. Behind him, the ship emitted a deep, resonant hum. Alira had activated the shield generator. A wave of golden light erupted from the vessel, spreading outward in all directions. The energy hit the hunter like a tidal wave, short-circuiting its systems and freezing it mid-attack. The hunter let out one final mechanical screech before collapsing, its massive frame crumpling to the ground. Jack stood frozen, his rifle still raised, as the golden light enveloped the forest. When the light faded, Jack turned back to the ship. Alira was standing in the entrance, her wristband glowing faintly. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a quiet sadness. "You did it," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "It's over." Alira shook her head. She pointed to the horizon, where faint glimmers of light marked the presence of other ships far above Earth. Her mission wasn't over yet, but for now, they had won. Jack exhaled deeply, lowering his rifle. "Guess we got more work to do," he said, a small grin tugging at his lips. Alira smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The stranger truth. The forest was eerily silent as the golden glow of the shield dissipated, leaving the early morning air heavy with the scent of scorched earth and ozone. The colossal remains of the hunter lay crumpled on the ground, its glowing red visor now dark. Jack lowered his rifle and let out a shaky breath, his body aching from the relentless chase. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe it was over. Then he turned toward the ship, where Alira stood silhouetted in the doorway. Her wristband glimmered faintly, but her expression was distant, her swirling, multi-hued eyes fixed on the horizon. She seemed less like a triumphant survivor and more like someone bracing for what came next. "You've got that look again," Jack said, trudging toward her. "That we're not out of the woods yet look. You want to clue me in on what's coming." Alira didn't respond immediately. Instead, she tapped her wristband, projecting a holographic image of the shield generator. It pulsed steadily, its energy signature visible across a vast, starry map. Jack recognized the image of Earth at the center, but it was surrounded by unfamiliar symbols and blinking red lights. Other ships, more massive than the Hunter, clustered just beyond the planet's orbit. Jack's stomach churned. "Let me guess. Your shield told them exactly where we are." Alira nodded, her expression apologetic but firm. She pointed to herself, then to the map, her fingers tracing the path of one of the massive ships. Finally, she turned to Jack and mind flying, gesturing for him to follow. Jack blinked, taken aback. "Wait, you're saying we leave? Together? Just like that?" Alira nodded again, stepping closer to him. She tapped her wristband, displaying another hologram, a small green planet surrounded by a peaceful fleet. The image shifted, showing humans, simplistic but unmistakable, standing side by side with alien figures, exchanging knowledge and resources. Jack stared at the hologram, his mind racing. "You're saying there's a future for us out there? For humans? And your people?" She nodded, but her expression grew darker as the hologram changed. The peaceful fleet was replaced by the massive, red-lit warships from before, their shadows consuming the galaxy. Alira pointed to the warships, then to Earth, shaking her head emphatically. Jack didn't need a translator to understand what she meant. If they get here first, it's not going to be pretty. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Alira worked quickly, her fingers flying over the console as she brought the ship's systems back online. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, and the walls glowed faintly as power coursed through the vessel. Jack stood near the entrance, his rifle slung over his shoulder, watching her with a mixture of awe and unease. "So let me get this straight," he said, breaking the silence. "You want me to hop on this thing, fly off into the great unknown, and trust that your people aren't going to turn me into some science experiment?" Alira paused, turning to face him. She pointed to herself, then to him, placing her hand over her heart. Her expression was soft, but serious, as if to say, "I'll protect you." Jack chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "You're something else, you know that." She smiled faintly, then returned to the console. The holographic map reappeared, showing their immediate surroundings. The shield generator's energy pulse was still active, but it was clear it wouldn't hold forever. A red marker indicated an incoming fleet, their arrival only a matter of hours away. "Guess I don't have much of a choice," Jack muttered, glancing out the window at the wreckage of the Hunter. "It's not like I've got a lot going on back here anyway." Alira's eyes softened. She gestured for him to take a seat in the co-pilot's chair, motioning to the controls. Jack hesitated but eventually complied, lowering himself into the seat. The interface was overwhelming, covered in alien symbols and glowing panels, but Alira quickly adjusted the display. The holograms shifted to show simplified diagrams that even Jack could understand. "Guess this is my crash course in alien piloting," he said, smirking. No pun intended. Alira rolled her eyes, a gesture so human it caught Jack off guard. For a moment, the tension lifted, replaced by an unspoken camaraderie. They had been through hell together, and now they were about to face something even bigger. As the ship lifted off, the ground fell away beneath them, the forest shrinking into a sea of green. Jack watched through the window as the cliffside and the wreckage of the Hunter disappeared from view. The vast expanse of Earth stretched out before him, a breathtaking reminder of what they were leaving behind. "You sure we're doing the right thing?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Alira placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression steady. She pointed to the holographic map, then to the peaceful green planet she had shown him before. Her message was clear. This is the only way. The ship pierced the atmosphere, the sky fading from blue to black as the stars came into view. Jack stared in awe as the Earth became a distant sphere, its fragile beauty more apparent than ever. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, leaving it behind. But then the proximity alarm blared. "What now?" Jack groaned, gripping the edge of his seat. Elira's expression hardened as the monitors displayed a new image. One of the massive warships, its red lights glowing ominously, emerging from hyperspace. It dwarfed their ship, its weapon systems already locking onto them. "You've got a plan for that, right?" Jack asked, his voice rising. Elira didn't respond. Instead, she pressed a series of buttons, and the ship's engines roared to life. The vessel shot forward, weaving through the stars as the warship fired its first volley. Energy blasts streaked past them, narrowly missing as Elira guided the ship with precise, almost instinctive movements. Jack clenched his fists, his heart pounding. This is insane. The ship dove into an asteroid field, using the debris as cover. Elira's movements were smooth and calculated, the vessel twisting and turning with impossible agility. The warship pursued them, its size making it slower, but no less dangerous. Jack could feel the vibrations of each near miss, the cabin shaking as energy blasts exploded around them. Finally, Elira activated a final command on her wristband. The shield generator, now fully charged, released a burst of energy that spread across the stars. The pulse disrupted the warship's systems, causing it to falter. Engines sputtered, weapons went dark, and the massive vessel drifted helplessly in space. Jack let out a shaky laugh, adrenaline still coursing through him. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Elira smiled, her eyes reflecting the starlight. She pointed to the green planet on the holographic map, its soft glow a beacon of hope. Jack leaned back in his seat, a faint grin on his face. "All right, Elira. Let's see where this crazy ride takes us." As the ship disappeared into the vastness of space, Earth faded behind them, a fragile but resilient world, now safe, at least for the moment. Ahead lay the unknown, a journey that would test them both. But for the first time, Jack felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years.